Kneel. The word cut through the ballroom like a blade. Vanessa Hawthorne didn't shout it. She didn't need to. 300 people in designer gowns and tailored suits heard it perfectly. Every phone in the room tilted upward, cameras already recording. Zaria Brooks stood very still. 30 years old. A black woman who had spent IP art years making this hotel look good, while it paid her less than the men she trained. She had never once raised her voice at a guest. Never once complained when they looked through her like glass. Now $500 worth of borrowed earrings were in her ears. Her best blazer was pressed and perfect. And a woman who had never worked a single day in her life was pointing a manicured finger at her chest and calling her a thief. "I said kneel," Vanessa repeated, "and apologize for disgracing respectable people. If you have ever been accused of something you didn't do, in front of people who had already decided you were guilty, then you already know exactly what Zaria felt in that moment. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications, because this is the kind of story you do not want to miss halfway through. And when you're done watching, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Zaria, because what happens next will change everything. The evening had started the way all good disasters do, quietly, and with every detail in its proper place. Zaria arrived at the Astoria Crown Hotel at 4:15 in the afternoon, which was 45 minutes before her shift technically required her presence, and approximately 2 hours before the first guests were scheduled to arrive. She had learned early in her career that arriving when you were supposed to arrive was the fastest way to spend your whole career putting out fires someone else started. She preferred to start the fire herself, the controlled kind, the kind that lit the room beautifully and burned nothing down. She walked the perimeter of the grand ballroom twice. She checked the floral arrangements against the client's specifications, measured the centerpieces with her eyes the way a musician listens for a note slightly off-key, and found 3 of them tilted just enough to bother her. She fixed them herself rather than waiting for someone from the decorating crew because the crew had gone to dinner and she did not want to hear excuses later about why it hadn't been done. The Harrington Foundation Gala was the most prestigious event the hotel hosted each year. It raised money, technically, for arts education in underserved communities. Though Zaria had noticed over her 3 years managing this particular event that the people writing the largest checks seemed far less interested in the children and considerably more interested in photographing one another holding those checks. But that was not her business. Her business was the room, the linens, the lighting, the flow of the evening. She was very good at her business. Marcus, one of the younger waiters she had trained herself, caught her by the kitchen entrance at 5 o'clock. "You eat anything today?" he asked. "I'll eat after." "You said that last time." "And I ate after last time." He gave her a look that said he didn't entirely believe her but knew better than to push it. She liked Marcus. He was 23 and hadn't yet learned to be cynical about the industry, which she sometimes envied and sometimes worried about in equal measure. "The lighting on the east side is still warm," she told him. "Tell Raymond before the guests arrive, not after, before." "Already told him." "Good." She moved on. By 7 o'clock, the ballroom was full of people who treated the air differently than regular people did, like they owned it, or had at least put down a deposit on it. Zaria had spent 8 years in luxury hospitality, and she still couldn't decide whether that quality was something money gave people or something they were born with. Either way, it created a specific kind of atmosphere she had learned to navigate with the precision of someone walking through a room full of sleeping animals. You kept your movements smooth. You kept your expression warm, but professional. You anticipated needs before they became demands. The Hawthorne family arrived at 7:42. Zaria knew who they were. Everyone who worked in the hotel industry in New York knew who the Hawthornes were. Gregory Hawthorne had built his fortune in real estate development over 3 decades, acquiring blocks of the city the way other men collected sports memorabilia, obsessively, and with more money than sentiment. He was in his late 60s, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, the kind of man whose appearance had been carefully constructed to project permanence. He walked into rooms like he had already decided they belonged to him. His daughter Vanessa was 27. Zaria had managed events where Vanessa was present before. She knew the profile well, a woman who had inherited her father's certainty without having to earn it, which created a particular kind of arrogance that was more dangerous than the calculated kind because it never questioned itself. Vanessa was beautiful in a way that had clearly been told to her many times, and she wore that knowledge like armor. She arrived tonight in a white gown that likely cost more than Zarya's annual rent and moved through the crowd with the comfortable ease of someone who had never once been made to feel she was taking up too much space. Which was, Zarya reflected, one of the core differences between them. Zarya had spent most of her adult life learning to take up exactly the right amount of space, enough to be effective, never enough to make anyone uncomfortable. The hotel industry had a particular relationship with bodies like hers, plus-size bodies, black bodies, bodies that did not match the gleaming marble surfaces and narrow aesthetic of luxury hospitality. She was good enough to run the events. She was not, apparently, good enough to be featured in the promotional photographs. She had stopped being surprised by that distinction a long time ago, though she hadn't entirely stopped being hurt by it. The evening progressed smoothly until 9:17. She knew the exact time because she glanced at her watch approximately 30 seconds before everything fell apart, mentally cataloging the remaining items on her checklist with the satisfied efficiency of someone who could see the finish line. The sound that interrupted her was not a crash. It was more delicate than that. A sharp musical note, like a single key struck on a piano in an empty room. It came from the direction of the display table near the east entrance, where the Harrington Foundation had arranged several pieces from their private collection alongside a centerpiece diamond necklace that had been loaned for the evening by a private collector. The necklace was reportedly valued at somewhere north of $400,000. Zarya had personally overseen its secure placement and had given specific instructions that no one, under any circumstances, was to handle it. She turned. Vanessa Hawthorne was standing at the display table. Her hand was in the air in the particular way a hand looks when it has just released something rather than when it is reaching for something. The necklace was on the table, but the clasp was visibly broken, and 3 of the smaller stones had scattered across the white linen surface. Their eyes met. For exactly 2 seconds, Zarya saw the truth on Vanessa's face. It was unmistakable. A flash of pure panic, the instinctive guilt of someone who has done something they cannot undo. Vanessa had been showing it off to her friends, probably lifting it, holding it up to the light, doing the thing Zarya had specifically asked everyone not to do. And then the panic disappeared. What replaced it was something colder and more deliberate. She was touching it, Vanessa said. Her voice carried. In the peculiar acoustics of the grand ballroom with the orchestra between sets and the general noise of the crowd at a temporary low, it carried extremely well. "Excuse me?" Zarya said. She kept her voice level. This was important. In her experience, the first 10 seconds of a false accusation determined the shape of everything that followed, and she had learned that maintaining calm in those 10 seconds, while deeply unnatural, was the most powerful tool available to her. "I saw you touching the necklace," Vanessa said, louder this time. She half turned toward her friends, toward the guests nearest to them. The shift in her body was deliberate. She was already building an audience. "And now the clasp is broken, and the stones are loose. Someone check her pockets." The word pockets landed in the room like something thrown. Zarya felt the temperature change before she heard it. The subtle but distinct shift in the air around her as people turned, as heads moved, as the specific attention of a crowd that smells an event focused itself in her direction. She had seen this before, not in this hotel, but in her life. This particular realignment of a room's energy when a black woman is publicly accused by a white woman in a space where the black woman is outnumbered. "I have not touched that necklace," Zarya said. "I was standing approximately 20 feet away when I heard the clasp give. I can tell you exactly where I was standing and who was near me." "She's lying," one of Vanessa's friends said. A young woman in a blue dress whose name Zarya didn't know, who had never met Zarya before in her life, and who had apparently decided in the span of 3 seconds that she had sufficient information to assess Zarya's character. Phones appeared. It happened with the specific speed of people who had already been holding their phones, waiting for something worth recording. Charles Remington, the hotel's director of events, materialized from the edge of the room with the particular haste of a man who had heard something that threatened his standing with the people who mattered to him. Charles was 54, wore his graying hair with the careful deliberateness of someone who had thought about it, and had spent 17 years in his position by mastering one fundamental skill, identifying very quickly which side of a conflict it was safest to be on. He looked at Vanessa. He looked at Zarya. "Ms. Brooks," he said carefully, "I think it's best if we eat." "I want to see the security footage," Zarya said. Something crossed Charles's face. It was brief, and she might have missed it if she hadn't spent 8 years reading the small expressions of people who were managing situations rather than resolving them. His eyes moved, just slightly, just for a moment, to a point somewhere above and behind her left shoulder. "There seems to have been a technical issue with the East Corridor cameras this evening," he said. The words were precise and flat, like something rehearsed. The room had gathered now. Not everyone. The event was large and many guests were still absorbed in their own conversations. But a significant cluster had formed, the specific shape of a crowd that is gathered around an incident. Several people were filming openly. Others filmed while pretending not to. A man in a red bow tie made a comment about hotel staff she didn't fully catch, but whose tone was unmistakable, and the people around him laughed. "Check her bag," someone said from the back. "She probably already moved it," another voice answered. Vanessa had fully transformed by now. The panic Zarya had seen in those first 2 seconds was gone without a trace, replaced by the practiced performance of a wronged woman, chin lifted, eyes glassy with strategic hurt, voice pitched at the precise frequency of someone who expected to be believed. "I'm shocked," Vanessa said. "I have attended this event for 7 years. 7 years. And this is what happens when we try to do something good for this city." The implication that Zarya's existence was an affront to charitable intention floated through the room and was accepted by no one explicitly and almost everyone implicitly. Zarya's hands were steady. She was aware of them specifically, in the way you become aware of parts of your body when you're concentrating on not betraying your interior state. Her pulse had moved, her jaw had tightened, but her hands were steady. "I would like to call our security manager," she said to Charles, "and I would like this conversation to move somewhere private." "I don't want it private," Vanessa said. "I want it exactly where it is. I want everyone to see what kind of person has been running this event." Marcus appeared at the edge of her peripheral vision, and she saw the expression on his face, young, frightened, furious, and she gave him the smallest possible shake of her head. "Do not get involved. It would not help her, and it would certainly not help him." 2 of the hotel's security officers arrived, moving with the reluctant urgency of people responding to something they didn't yet fully understand. They were not malicious. Zarya knew both of them, had worked with them for years, but they were in a room full of people with money, and their training had oriented them, perhaps without their conscious awareness, toward the comfort of that money. "Ms. Brooks," said the taller one, Devin, "we're going to need you to step aside. I'm not going anywhere until someone explains to me what I'm being accused of specifically and on what evidence." "There's video," Vanessa said. "You just told Charles the East cameras had a technical issue." The room went very slightly quieter. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. For a fraction of a second, the performance slipped. Not enough for the crowd to catch it, but enough for Zarya to see it clearly. Enough to confirm what she already knew. Then Vanessa said something that Zarya had not anticipated, something that changed the shape of the evening in a way she could not have prepared for. "Her bag," Vanessa said to Devin. "Search her bag. I'm telling you, you'll find what you're looking for." Zarya did not understand, in that moment, why Vanessa was so certain. She would understand later. She would understand a great many things later that she could not see clearly now, standing in the ballroom under the weight of 300 eyes and the hot light of phone screens pointed at her face. Devin looked at Zarya with the specific expression of a man who does not want to do something but has calculated that refusing will cost him more than complying. "Ms. Brooks, your bag." She handed it over. The room was very quiet. Devin opened the bag and produced, from somewhere near the bottom, 3 small diamonds and the broken necklace clasp. She had not put them there. She knew she had not put them there. But the room didn't know that, and in the mathematics of public accusation, A room full of people who want to believe something is far more powerful than the truth held by one person who knows it. The laughter started somewhere in the middle of the crowd. Not cruel laughter exactly, or not only cruel laughter, but the laughter of people who are relieved to have been given permission to find something funny, to turn an uncomfortable moment into entertainment. She heard her weight mentioned. She heard her skin mentioned. She heard, from a man standing close enough that she could have touched him, a comment about help that shouldn't be trusted in fine establishments, and the woman beside him murmured in agreement. She was shaking, not visibly. She was almost certain not visibly. But inside, somewhere behind her sternum, something had broken open that she was going to have to deal with much later when she was alone and there was no one watching. "Kneel," Vanessa said, and the room went quiet again. "Kneel and apologize for disgracing respectable people." Everything that followed happened in a kind of fractured slow motion. The security officers, not roughly, not cruelly, but with the irreversible certainty of people following the implicit instruction of the room, pressed her shoulders down. The pressure was not violent. It was somehow worse for not being violent, because violence she could have named. This was just gravity and politics and the weight of 300 people who had made their decision. Her knees met the floor. The marble was cold through the fabric of her best slacks. The phones tilted toward her. The laughter continued in scattered pockets. Vanessa looked down at her with an expression that Zarya would remember for years. Not triumph, exactly. Something more like satisfaction. The satisfaction of a person who has tested a belief and found it confirmed. Zarya looked at the floor. She would not beg. She had decided that before her knees touched the marble, in the half-second of resistance, before the pressure became inevitable, she would not confess. She would not give them the specific performance they had gathered to watch. She would stay quiet, and she would stay whole, and she would deal with everything else on the other side of this moment. "Apologize," Vanessa said. Zarya said nothing. "Apologize." "I have nothing to apologize for," Zarya said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I didn't take anything. I didn't break anything. And I will not say that I did." More laughter. A comment about stubbornness, a comment about knowing your place. She was still on her knees when the ballroom doors opened. She didn't hear them open, not over the noise of the crowd. But she felt the change in the room the way you feel a pressure shift before a storm. The laughter stopped. The comments stopped. The specific ambient noise of a crowd that is enjoying itself ceased in a wave that moved from the back of the room toward the front, like a light being turned off in sections. She raised her eyes. A man stood in the doorway. He was tall, genuinely tall, not the exaggerated tallness of memory, but the kind that occupies space in an objective, physical way. He wore a black suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who have worn expensive things their whole lives, which is to say, perfectly, without effort. He was not young, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that had been shaped by weather and decision. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room with an expression that contained no readable emotion whatsoever. He looked at Vanessa. He looked at the phones. He looked at the people who were still laughing, and one by one, those people stopped. Then he looked at Zarya, kneeling on the cold marble floor of the grand ballroom of the Astoria Crown Hotel, with her hands in her lap and her dignity held in both of them by the thinnest possible thread. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked into the room, and the crowd separated in front of him without him asking, the way water moves when something certain passes through it. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved their phone. Vanessa Hawthorne, who had not been afraid of anything in this room until 30 seconds ago, took a very small, very involuntary step backward. His name was Massimo De Luca, and every person in that room who mattered, every person with sufficient knowledge of how power actually operated in this city, beneath the charity galas and the charitable causes and the clean marble surfaces, knew exactly who he was. And not one of them knew why he was here, or what he had just seen, or what he intended to do about it. Massimo De Luca did not cross the room quickly. That was the first thing people noticed, not what he did, but the pace at which he did it. Every instinct in a room like this, when something went wrong, produced urgency. People moved fast. People talked over each other. People filled silence with noise because silence, in a crisis, felt like surrender. Massimo moved the way a man moves when he has already decided the outcome and is simply allowing events to catch up to his decision. One step, then another. His hands were at his sides. His face gave nothing. The crowd that had parted for him stayed parted, the way people unconsciously maintain distance from things they cannot categorize. He stopped approximately 10 feet from Zarya. He did not help her up. He did not speak to her. He stood there and he looked at Vanessa Hawthorne with an expression that was so entirely absent of anger that it was somehow more frightening than anger would have been. Anger was legible. Anger told you what a person felt. This told you nothing, and the absence of information in a man whose reputation preceded him into every room in the city produced a very specific kind of fear in people who had reasons to be afraid. Vanessa had reasons. She didn't know yet how many. "Mr. DeLuca," she said, and her voice had changed. Not dramatically. She was too practiced for that. But the particular bright confidence she had used for the last 20 minutes had thinned, become slightly effortful, like a smile held too long. "I wasn't aware you were attending tonight." "I wasn't on the list," Massimo said. His voice was low and unhurried. It was the voice of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "Well?" Vanessa gestured vaguely at the room, at Zarya still on the floor, at the phone still recording. "I'm sure you can see we've had a situation. One of the staff was caught stealing from the display collection. It's being handled." Massimo looked at her for 3 full seconds without speaking. "Is it?" he said. It was not a question. Vanessa received it as one anyway. "Yes, the clasp on the Meridian necklace was broken and the stones were recovered from her bag. We have witnesses." "How many witnesses saw her touch the necklace?" Vanessa blinked. "I'm sorry?" "I asked how many witnesses saw her touch the necklace. Not the bag, the necklace." The room had gone the specific quiet of people who are paying full attention but do not want to appear to be paying full attention. Phones were still raised, but no one was commenting anymore. The man in the red bow tie had become very interested in his champagne glass. "I saw her," Vanessa said. "You saw her?" "Yes." "From where?" "I was standing right there." She pointed at the display table. "I saw her reach for it." Massimo turned his head slightly and looked at the display table, then back at Vanessa. The geometry of the room was simple. If Vanessa had been standing at the display table and Zarya had been standing approximately 20 feet away, which was where Zarya had told Devon she was standing when the clasp broke, a detail Massimo had apparently absorbed without appearing to be listening, then Vanessa's account had a structural problem. He didn't point this out. He just looked at her and let her live inside the implication. Zarya, still on the floor, was watching this exchange with the focused attention of someone who has stopped expecting rescue and started paying extremely close attention to the terrain. Her knees hurt. The marble was harder and colder than she had anticipated when she was being pressed down onto it, which was, she reflected, probably because she had never anticipated being pressed down onto it. She was aware that getting up without being told to might create a problem, and she was also aware that staying down was eroding something in her that she was going to need later. She stayed down. But she watched. Charles Remington had positioned himself at the edge of the gathering in the specific posture of a man trying to be visible enough to seem in control and invisible enough to avoid direct questions. He had watched Massimo's arrival with an expression Zarya could not fully read from her angle, but which Marcus, standing closer, would later describe to her as the expression of a man who has realized he has bet on the wrong outcome. "Mr. Remington," Massimo said without turning his head. Charles straightened. "Yes, Mr. DeLuca." "These corridor cameras." "Yes, sir. There was a technical malfunction this evening. We're looking into—" "When did you discover the malfunction?" A pause. Brief, but there. "Around 7:30, I believe?" "Before the guests arrived." "That's correct." "And you didn't arrange for backup coverage?" It happened quickly, and we didn't anticipate... You didn't anticipate that a $400,000 piece of jewelry displayed in a room with no camera coverage might create a liability." Charles's jaw moved. "No, sir. In hindsight, Massimo repeated. And that was all he said about it. He turned back to the room. His gaze moved across it in a way that was neither dramatic nor hurried, methodical, the way a person reads a document they have been given time to study. He looked at the faces of the guests near the display table. He looked at the security officers. He looked at Vanessa's friends. The woman in the blue dress had stopped filming and was now holding her phone down at her side with the studied casualness of someone trying to appear unimportant. Then he looked at a point somewhere in the middle distance, at a waiter in a white jacket who was standing near the east wall with a tray that he was holding approximately 2 inches lower than a professional would hold it, which was the kind of detail that registered not as conscious observation, but as wrongness. The same way a musician hears a note that's been played correctly, but in the wrong key. The waiter looked away. Massimo looked at him for one more second, and then looked somewhere else. And to anyone watching, it appeared he had simply been scanning the room. But one of the 2 men who had accompanied Massimo to the event, men who had entered separately and positioned themselves at different points in the ballroom, which was something nobody had noticed because they were very practiced at not being noticed, received a signal that was not a word and not a gesture, but was nonetheless received and understood completely. Zarya watched the waiter's face change. She didn't know why. She filed it. "Let her up," Massimo said. Devin, who had not been addressed directly but understood the instruction was for him, reached down. Zarya didn't take his hand. She placed her own palm flat on the floor and pushed herself up, which was harder than she would have liked. And her right knee had stiffened, and she was aware of it, but she set her jaw and stood straight and did not let the stiffness show in her face. She stood. She did not thank Massimo De Luca. She wasn't sure why she didn't. Instinct, maybe? Or the particular pride of someone who had not yet decided what she owed him, if anything. She straightened her blazer and looked at the room with an expression that she had spent years constructing, the professional expression, the one that said she was fine and in control and this was manageable, even when it was not. Vanessa's eyes moved from Zarya to Massimo and back again, making a calculation. "She still needs to be held until the police arrive," Vanessa said. Her voice had restabilized. She had found something to hold on to. The procedural logic of the situation, the fact that regardless of who was in the room, stones had been found in a bag. Witnesses existed, and that sequence of events had a natural conclusion. "Those are the facts. Whatever else is going on here, those are the facts." "The facts," Massimo said. "Yes." "You'd like to talk about the facts?" "I would." He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and produced a phone. He did not look at it. He held it at his side and looked at Vanessa steadily. "My team has been working for the last 11 minutes, he said, "while you were explaining the facts to everyone." Vanessa said nothing. 11 minutes is enough time to find quite a few things, he said, depending on what you're looking for. The room had gone past quiet now. It had reached the specific register of silence that happens when a large number of people simultaneously understand that the situation they believe they were observing is not the situation that is actually occurring. "I don't know what you think your team could possibly—" "There are 12 external cameras on this building," Massimo said. "The hotel owns 4 of them. The building across the street owns 2. The city owns 3 traffic cameras covering the east and south entrances. A private security company monitoring the parking structure owns the remaining 3. Mr. Remington arranged for the hotel's internal east corridor cameras to have a technical malfunction. He did not arrange for the other 8. Charles Remington made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when something lands on them that they cannot immediately process. A short, compressed exhale, almost inaudible. The sound of a specific kind of collapse happening somewhere internal. "That's—" he started. "Don't," Massimo said quietly. Charles stopped. Vanessa's face had changed. This time it was not subtle and it was not brief. Something behind her eyes had shifted structurally, like a wall that has absorbed too much pressure and is beginning, quietly, to give. But she had not grown up around money and learned nothing from it, and what money had taught her, above everything else, was that the first person to flinch lost. She didn't flinch. "Even if that were true," she said, "it doesn't change what was found in her bag." "No," Massimo agreed. "It changes how it got there." The silence that followed was the kind that has a shape. Zarya felt it land in her chest. Not relief, not yet, because she had been in enough situations where the truth surfaced too late or too quietly to prevent the damage that had already been done. But something shifted in the room. She could feel it the way you feel a temperature change before you can name it, the gradual withdrawal of certainty from the people who had been certain. The woman in the blue dress said, quietly, to the person beside her, "We should probably—" "Stay," Massimo said. He had not looked at her. He had not raised his voice, but she stayed. "Nobody leaves this room," Massimo said, still at the same volume, still looking at Vanessa. "Not yet." One of the guests near the back, an older man in a charcoal suit, someone with the bearing of a person accustomed to giving instructions rather than receiving them, took a step toward the exit. The man who had entered with Massimo and positioned himself by the west wall moved, in a way that was not aggressive and not confrontational, but was simply suddenly present, into the space between the charcoal suit and the door. The older man stopped. "This is not legal," he said. "You're welcome to call someone," Massimo said. A pause. The older man did not call anyone. He returned to his spot. Zarya looked at Massimo's profile. She was trying to determine what she was standing inside of. Whether she had been pulled out of one bad situation and placed into another one, whether the shift in the room's power was a rescue or a substitution. She did not know enough about Massimo De Luca to know which it was. She knew the name. Everyone in New York knew the name in the way you know the name of a weather system, a thing with measurable effects and uncertain intentions. He had not hurt her. He had not touched her. He had stood in a room and spoken very quietly, and the entire architecture of the evening had reorganized itself around him. That could mean many things. She did not trust it yet, but she was standing, and her knees were her own, and for the moment that was enough. Vanessa turned to Charles with an expression that was sharp and pressured and held a very specific message. Charles received it and looked away. He had been receiving Vanessa's messages for the better part of 3 years. In this hotel, at this event, in the specific transactional relationship between the Hawthorne family's patronage and his position, and he had always responded to those messages in the way she expected. But Massimo De Luca was standing 12 feet from him and had just demonstrated in approximately 4 minutes that he knew things Charles had believed were unknowable. Charles Remington made the calculation of his professional life in about 8 seconds. He looked at the floor. Vanessa understood immediately that he had decided something. Her lips pressed together. She looked back at Massimo. "Whatever my father's assistant said," she started. "I haven't spoken to your father's assistant," Massimo said. He looked at the waiter near the east wall. The waiter was not a waiter. He was 24 years old, and his name was something he had given that evening that was not his actual name. And he had been placed in this room by someone whose instructions he was now deeply regretting, because the man in the black suit had looked at him twice in the last 8 minutes, and each time the look had lasted exactly 1 second and said, without words, that the looking was not random. He set the tray down on the nearest surface. The man who had been stationed near the west wall was now near the east wall, close enough to the not waiter that the geometry of their positions formed a shape with only one reasonable interpretation. Zarya watched the not waiter's shoulders drop. It was the drop of someone who has just released the effort of pretending. "The bag," Massimo said to him. Not her bag. A bag. A different bag. The not waiter looked at Massimo for a long moment, and then looked at the floor with the specific defeat of someone doing the math on their options and finding all of them worse than compliance. He reached into the jacket of his waiter's uniform, the chest pocket, which a real waiter would not have used because it threw off the line of the jacket, and every hospitality professional knew this, and produced a folded piece of cloth the size of a handkerchief. He set it on the empty tray. Massimo's associate picked it up, unfolded it, and walked it to Massimo without opening it further. Massimo looked at it. Then he looked at Vanessa's personal assistant, a quiet woman named Greta, 29, who had been standing in Vanessa's peripheral shadow for the entire evening with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned that being noticed was its own kind of risk. Greta was already pale. She became, in the specific second when Massimo looked at her, the particular color of someone experiencing the physiological effects of being caught. "The other bag," Massimo said. "I don't know what—" "Greta," Vanessa said sharply. Greta went quiet. Vanessa was reassessing. Zarya could see it happening in real time. Not panic, not yet, but the controlled recalibration of a person who has encountered an obstacle that exceeds what she prepared for. She had prepared for a lot. She had prepared for a challenging evening, for the possibility that someone might question the story, for the remote chance that a piece of the plan might come loose. She had not prepared for Massimo De Luca to arrive uninvited, observe everything in silence, and produce evidence from the room itself in under 15 minutes. "Whatever you think you have," Vanessa said, her voice dropping, moving from public performance to something more direct, more private. "You need to think carefully about what you're doing. My father, your father," Massimo said, "is the reason I'm here." The room received this. Zarya received it, even in the specific distress of her own situation, even with her knees stiffening and her hands steadying themselves through force of will and the emotional wreckage of the last 40 minutes sitting in her chest like something swallowed wrong. She heard that sentence and understood that the evening had just taken a turn that had nothing to do with her and had apparently had nothing to do with her from the beginning. She had been a prop. The understanding arrived not as shock, but as a particular nauseating clarity. The feeling of a picture that has been slightly out of focus finally sharpening into an image you didn't want to see. The necklace, the accusation, the crowd, the phones, the kneeling, none of it was really about her. She was the distraction, the performance, the thing the audience watched while the real event happened somewhere else, in some quieter part of the hotel she hadn't been paying attention to because she had been trying not to cry on a marble floor while 300 people filmed her. She was useful because she was easy to dismiss. She was chosen because no one would look past her to see what was actually happening. The fury that moved through her then was different from what she had felt while kneeling. That had been helpless and hot and close to the surface. This was something colder and more structural, the fury of understanding rather than the fury of experiencing, and it went somewhere deeper and stayed. "What are you talking about?" Vanessa said. Her voice had changed again, thinner now, less constructed. "There's a private vault beneath this hotel," Massimo said. "Your father has known about it for approximately 4 months. He has spent those 4 months waiting for an event large enough to provide sufficient distraction." Silence. "Tonight provided an excellent distraction," Massimo continued. "A black woman accused of theft at a charity gala. Every phone in the room, every eye, every piece of attention aimed at one person in one corner of one room, while 12 levels below this floor." "Stop," Vanessa said. "2 men with technical skills and a copied access code removed a set of financial records that your father's legal team has been trying to make disappear for approximately 16 months. Stop. The records document a series of transactions between your father's development company and a network of shell accounts that have been under federal review since—" "Stop," her voice cracked, not with grief, with the specific pressured desperation of someone trying to shut a door that is already open. "You don't know what you're—" "He chose you for tonight," Massimo said. "Did he tell you that? That you specifically were the instrument because you were the most reliable person he knew for causing exactly this kind of scene, with exactly this kind of attention, in exactly this kind of room?" Vanessa went very still. Something moved across her face that was unlike anything that had moved across it during the previous 40 minutes. All of the performance fell away from it completely, the way a costume falls when someone stops holding it up. What remained was younger and less composed and considerably more real. "He didn't tell you," Massimo said, not unkindly. Zarya watched Vanessa Hawthorne realize, in front of 300 people and 24 phone cameras, that she had been used. The irony was not lost on her. She suspected it was not lost on Massimo either. "The men in the vault," Massimo continued, his voice returning to its baseline, even, unhurried, certain, "have been detained. The records are intact. Federal authorities are being contacted by someone in this room whose identity I won't specify, because that's their business to make public in their own time." He turned then and looked at Zarya directly for the first time since he had entered the room. She held his gaze. She did not know what she expected to find in his face. Something readable, maybe. Some indication of motive, of intention, of whether she should feel rescued or leveraged or simply witnessed. His eyes were dark, and his expression was the same one he had worn since the moment he walked through the door, absent of performance, absent of the specific emotional signaling people used to tell each other what they wanted from the interaction. He said to her, in a voice low enough that it did not carry, "You didn't break." She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said, "I didn't." He held her gaze a second longer, then looked away, and something about the way he looked away, not dismissively, but with the specific quality of a person who has said what they came to say, made Zarya understand that whatever this man was, whatever his presence in this room meant or would eventually cost, he had noticed the thing she had tried hardest not to let anyone take from her. And then the night stopped being over. Gregory Hawthorne's car, which had been parked 2 blocks from the hotel in an underground structure, left its space at 11:49. His driver had received an instruction that amounted to 4 words on a secure line, and those 4 words had been composed in the specific tense of a man who has heard, through a connection he should not have had access to but did, that the operation he had been running for 16 months, the patient, expensive, ruthlessly planned operation that had required 6 months of placement, a bought hotel director, a daughter whose vanity was a reliable instrument, and one carefully selected, entirely blameless woman, had been compromised. Gregory did not know by whom, he did not know how much had been exposed, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty, the thing that men in his position always knew when a plan collapsed. There was someone in that building who had what he needed, and he could not allow that person to leave with it intact. His phone reached an assistant. His assistant reached 2 other men. Those 2 men reached, within 90 seconds, a number that connected to a phone in the possession of a woman named Patricia Brooks, who was 49 years old and lived in Flatbush and was, at 11:49 on a Thursday evening, watching television in her kitchen. Her son answered the door 12 minutes later. His name was Devin Brooks, and he was 22 years old, and he was Zarya's younger brother. And he opened the door because the knock was authoritative and he thought it was his neighbor. And by the time he understood that it was not his neighbor, the door was already fully open, and there were 2 people on the other side of it, and one of them said his name with the specific flat certainty of someone who already knows the answer to the question they are asking. Devin's phone was in his bedroom, the door closed. No one in the ballroom knew yet. Not Zarya, not Massimo, not the 300 guests who were still standing in the grand ballroom of the Astoria Crown Hotel, caught between the event they came for and the event they had wandered into. But Gregory Hawthorne's car was moving, and the evening, which had already been the worst of Zarya Brooks's professional life, had not yet become the worst night of anything else. The call came through at 11:57. Not to Zarya, not to Massimo. It came to one of the 2 men Massimo had positioned in the ballroom, the one near the east wall, who had been watching the knot waiter and who had, in the interim 11 minutes, moved the knot waiter to a service corridor with the quiet efficiency of someone relocating furniture. This man's name was Sal, and he had worked for Massimo De Luca for 14 years, and he received information the way most people received weather, without surprise, without drama, as a condition to be accounted for rather than an event to be processed. He crossed the ballroom floor in 18 seconds. He reached Massimo and said 3 words very close to his ear. Zarya was standing 6 feet away. She did not hear the words. She heard the change in Massimo's body. Not movement, exactly, but a kind of recalibration, a shift in the quality of his stillness that was different from the stillness that had preceded it. She had worked with enough people in enough high-pressure situations to know that there were different kinds of controlled. There was the controlled of someone managing a situation, and there was the controlled of someone managing themselves, which was harder and looked different if you knew what to look for. This was the second kind. He turned and looked at her. "Your brother," he said. "Devin." The name in his mouth stopped her heart for exactly 1 second. "What about Devin?" It was not a question. Her voice had done something she had not instructed it to do. It had flattened, become precise, stripped of everything except the need for information. The same thing happened to her hands. They went very still at her sides. "He opened his door approximately 12 minutes ago," Massimo said. "He hasn't sent a message since." "How do you know when he last—" "I had eyes on your family when Gregory Hawthorne's car left the parking structure. I didn't know why yet. Now I do." The room was still full of people. The 300 guests of the Harrington Foundation Gala were still standing in the grand ballroom of the Astoria Crown Hotel, some confused, some frightened, some filming with the persistent compulsion of people who had not yet determined whether what they were watching was dangerous or merely interesting. Vanessa was near the display table with her assistant and two of her friends, her earlier composure replaced by something that looked like a woman standing in a room that is slowly changing temperature around her. Charles Remington had not moved from his position near the east wall. He was looking at the floor with the expression of a man mentally cataloging his exits. None of this registered to Zarya anymore. "Where is he?" she said. "We don't know yet." "Then find out." The directness of it, not a request, not a negotiation, just an instruction delivered to a man who was not accustomed to receiving instructions, landed in the space between them and stayed there for a moment. Massimo looked at her. "We're working on it," he said. "Work faster." She was already moving toward the edge of the crowd, her body making the decision before her mind had finished catching up. Marcus appeared at her left. He had been watching from the kitchen entrance for the last 20 minutes, unable to enter and unable to leave, his face doing the specific thing it did when he was trying not to show how frightened he was. She grabbed his arm as she passed. "My bag," she said. "Not the one they searched. My actual bag, the one I left in the event office. Get it and meet me in the hall. Now." "Zarya, what's—" "Now, Marcus." She pushed through the edge of the crowd and into the corridor outside the ballroom. The corridor was wide and marble-floored and emptied of the hotel staff who should have been stationed along it. They had drifted toward the ballroom entrance when the commotion started, the natural human pull toward event and spectacle. She was alone in the corridor for about 4 seconds before Massimo came through the door behind her. She turned on him immediately. "Tell me everything you know. Not the version that protects me from being frightened, all of it." He considered her for a moment. "Gregory Hawthorne has 2 men on retainer who are not on any public payroll. They handle situations he can't handle through legitimate channels. Devon was likely approached as leverage, a guarantee that the evidence my team recovered wouldn't be used before Gregory could establish distance. He took my brother to stop you. He took your brother because he believed it would stop me. Will it?" The question hung in the corridor air. It was a genuine question, not a challenge. She needed to know the actual answer, not the reassuring answer, because the actual answer would determine what she did next. Massimo said, "No." She looked at him. "Then Devon is still in danger even if you do everything Gregory wants." "Yes." "So we find Devon ourselves." "My people are all ready." "I'm not waiting for your people," she said. "Devon is 22 years old, and he is somewhere in this city because Gregory Hawthorne needed a way to control a situation that involved me. That means whatever Devon knows, whatever they told him or didn't tell him, is connected to this evening, to this hotel, to whatever is in that vault." She stopped. Something had shifted in her face, not visible to anyone who didn't know her well, but a specific internal movement, the kind that happens when a person who has been in shock begins to think clearly again. The adrenaline of the ballroom, the humiliation, the kneeling, the subsequent 40 minutes of controlled chaos, all of it had been running on its own momentum, carrying her forward without requiring her to think. Now something had cut through it. "The vault," she said. "Gregory's men were in the vault during the distraction. You said financial records." "Records and 1 physical item, a drive." "Where's the drive now?" "With my team." "Gregory doesn't know that." Massimo paused. It was a very brief pause, but it was real. "No," he said. "He knows the operation was compromised. He doesn't know the specific state of the drive. So he thinks if he gets Devon back to you, you'll give him the drive to get Devon back. That's the assumed leverage. But you're not going to do that." "No." "Because the drive goes away with you regardless of what happens to Devon." "That's not—" He stopped. She looked at him steadily. "I'm not saying you don't care what happens to Devon. I'm saying the drive doesn't change regardless. I'm saying Devon is only leverage if you're willing to treat the drive as negotiable. And you're not. Which means Devon's value to Gregory disappears the moment Gregory understands that." Massimo said nothing. "Which means we have a window," Zarya said. While Gregory still believes Devon is leverage, if we use that window wrong, Devon becomes a liability instead of an asset. And people who take liabilities don't usually... I know, Massimo said. His voice was quiet and without texture, and the flatness of it told her that he had already processed this sequence of logic before she had finished articulating it, and that the processing had landed somewhere that he was not particularly comfortable with. Marcus came through the ballroom door at that moment with her bag, and a face that was asking 15 questions he had correctly determined were not the moment's priority. She took the bag, found her personal phone, not the hotel-issued one, her own, with Devon's contact already pulled up, and called him. 3 rings. 4. Voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She called their mother. Patricia picked up on the first ring, which was already wrong, because Patricia Brooks did not pick up on the first ring after 11 o'clock. She either didn't hear it or was already asleep, and the speed of her answer meant she was awake and waiting, which meant she already knew something was wrong. Z, her mother's voice had the specific thinness of someone who has been frightened for long enough that the fear has used up most of the available air. Where's Devon, Mom? He went to answer the door. That was a pause in which Zarya could hear her mother doing the arithmetic. That was a while ago. He didn't come back. I went and the door was open and the street was... Her voice broke, very briefly. She put it back together with the particular discipline of a woman who had spent 30 years putting things back together. The street was empty. Okay, Zarya said. Okay, Mom, listen to me. Lock the door and don't open it for anyone. Do you hear me? Anyone. I'm going to find him. Z, I'm going to find him. Lock the door. She hung up. She was aware that her hands were not steady anymore. She had noticed this the way you notice a car drifting across a lane line. Not immediately, but as an accumulating wrongness that suddenly registers as specific. She pressed both palms flat against her thighs for 3 seconds. Then she looked at Massimo. Tell me where Gregory Hawthorne goes when he needs something to disappear. What followed was not, in any cinematic sense, a clean operation. Massimo's intelligence network was real and functional and had, in the course of the evening, performed several things that by right should have taken days. But finding a specific person in a city of 8 million people in real time, without knowing the vehicle, without knowing the destination, working from a 12-minute head start, that was a different problem. It was a problem with more variables than certainties, and Massimo De Luca, who had built his entire professional existence on the management of variables, was in the specific position of a man who can see the shape of something without being able to see the thing itself. They moved to a suite on the 14th floor, Massimo's, booked under a name that connected to nothing and no one, while 2 of his associates maintained positions in the ballroom, ensuring that no one significant left while the situation remained open. Charles Remington was still in the ballroom. Vanessa was still in the ballroom. The not waiter was in a service corridor with Sal. The assembled guests of the Harrington Foundation Gala were beginning to understand collectively, and without anyone explaining it to them, that they were not going to be leaving soon, and the mood had shifted from entertainment to unease in the specific way crowds shift when they realize the walls of a situation include them. In the suite, Massimo's third associate, a woman named Dara, who was 38 and had the particular focus quality of someone who finds screens more legible than people, had a laptop open on the room's desk and 2 phones active simultaneously. She did not look up when Zarya entered. Traffic cameras put a black SUV, no plates, heading south on Amsterdam at 11:52, Dara said. Lost it at the construction diversion on 155th. There's a gap in coverage for about 6 blocks. Gregory's property's in that corridor, Massimo said. Nothing registered to him directly. 3 shell company addresses. She read them. They were street addresses, and they meant nothing to Zarya. She stood near the window and listened with the focused helplessness of someone who knows the right thing is happening but cannot be the one doing it. That helplessness lasted about 4 minutes. Then she said, "The federal courthouse?" Dara looked up. Massimo looked at her. "The old Whitmore courthouse on 158th, Zarya said. It's been closed since the district reorganized in 2019. Gregory Hawthorne's development company purchased the air rights to the parcel next to it 18 months ago. There was a dispute about the building's historical status that's been in arbitration ever since. Nobody uses the building. But Gregory's legal team has had access to it for the arbitration process. They'd have keys, they'd know the layout, they'd know the cameras are city-owned and haven't been maintained since the building closed. The silence in the room had a different quality than the silence in the ballroom. This one was working. Dara typed, "Air rights purchase confirmed," she said. "Whitmore Courthouse. Last city inspection was 14 months ago." Massimo looked at Zarya. "How do you know about the air rights purchase?" he said. "The hotel hosted the arbitration lunch meetings for 6 months," she said. "I run events. I listen." "It's the same skill you used in the ballroom." Something shifted in his expression. "Not much. Enough." "I'm going with you," Zarya said. "No. Devin is my brother." "Which is exactly why I'm going," she said. "Don't tell me it's dangerous. Everything tonight has been dangerous. Don't tell me I'll be a liability. You watched me hold myself together on a marble floor for 20 minutes while 300 people filmed it and laughed. I am not a liability. I am someone who knows Gregory Hawthorne's patterns because I have been managing events for his family for 3 years. And if Devin is in that building, I know things about how Gregory thinks that you don't." Massimo looked at her. She looked back. "You're not armed," he said. "No." "You're not trained." "No." "You're going to do what I say when I say it, without argument." She considered this for exactly 1 second. "If it's the right call," she said. "Yes." He made a sound that might have been a very compressed version of something like acknowledgement, or might have been something else entirely. He turned to Dara. "Get the car." The drive took 9 minutes, which was shorter than it should have been at midnight on a Thursday, and Zarya spent those 9 minutes in the back seat of a vehicle whose model she didn't register, sitting beside a man whose silences had a weight and texture that most people's conversations didn't achieve, watching the city past the window and trying to keep her brain on the problem rather than on the image of Devin opening a door. Devin was not a complicated person. That was something she had always loved about him, and occasionally worried about. He was 22 and straightforward, and had their mother's instinct for trusting people and their father's inability to walk away from a challenge. And he had opened that door because that was the kind of person he was. And now he was in an abandoned courthouse in the middle of the night because Zarya had been chosen to be humiliated in a ballroom. And the chain of causality between those two facts was so direct and so brutal that every time her mind followed it to its conclusion, it produced a physical sensation in her chest that she was handling by not following it to its conclusion. She looked at Massimo. "Gregory's going to know pretty quickly that his play didn't work," she said. "That you're not going to trade the drive." "Yes." "How long do we have before he recalculates?" "Depends on who's feeding him information from the hotel. We don't know yet what his connection to the ballroom is." "Charles," she said immediately. Massimo looked at her. "Charles Remington has been running interference for the Hawthorne family for at least 2 years. I didn't know how deep it went, but I noticed things. A booking that got quietly canceled after a Hawthorne function the year before last. A staff member who raised concerns about some storage area access and was let go 6 weeks later with a settlement that required a confidentiality agreement. You don't offer confidentiality agreements for minor HR issues." She paused. "Charles is Gregory's eyes in that building. Whatever your people are doing to keep him in that ballroom, they need to make sure he hasn't already made a call." Dara, in the front passenger seat, was on a phone. 30 seconds later. "Remington's personal cell has been inactive since 11:40, battery pulled or airplane mode. The information settled in the car like something dropped from a height." "He already called," Massimo said. "Before you arrived," Zarya said. "When Gregory's car left, Charles got the signal and went dark." "Which means Gregory already knows the timeline. He knows we're coming." She said nothing. The car stopped. The Whitmore Courthouse was a building that had once been intended to project the authority and permanence of the law, which meant it was stone-faced and columned and considerably larger than its current vacancy required. The surrounding blocks were a mixture of residential construction and vacant lots, the architectural archaeology of a neighborhood in the specific phase of development that hadn't yet decided what it was becoming. At midnight, the street was empty except for a produce truck 3 blocks north and a delivery vehicle idling outside a closed restaurant. No lights in the courthouse. Zarya looked at the building, and her chest did the thing again, and she pressed it back down. Massimo's associate, not Sal, the other one, a man she had not been introduced to and who had not introduced himself, was already out of the car and moving toward the building's south side. Sal had remained at the hotel. This man moved with a quality that Zarya filed as professional without wanting to examine the specifics of what that profession entailed. "Stay close," Massimo said to her. "When I stop, you stop. When I move, you follow. If I tell you to go back to the car, you go back to the car. And if I see something, you don't. Tell me." The courthouse door, not the main entrance but a side door on the building's east face, was unlocked. Not open, but unlocked, which was its own kind of statement. Either it had been left that way deliberately, which was an invitation, or it had been left that way carelessly, which was a mistake. Massimo read it as an invitation. He moved through it with the caution of someone entering a room where the furniture has been rearranged in the dark. The interior was cold. Buildings that haven't been occupied in years retain cold differently than empty rooms. It's a specific, settled cold, the cold of a space that has forgotten what warmth feels like. The main corridor was dark, except for the ambient light coming through high, dusty windows, enough to see shapes and not details. Massimo's associate moved ahead. Massimo kept pace approximately 8 feet behind him. Zarya stayed close to Massimo, her hand not touching the wall, because the wall was the kind of surface that made sound when contacted. The sound reached them before anything else did. It was Devon's voice. She knew it completely, not because she could make out words, but because she knew the specific frequency of him, the way siblings carry each other's voices in some registry that predates memory. He was talking. He was alive and talking, and the relief that moved through her was so physical and so abrupt that her right knee nearly gave, the same knee that had stiffened on the marble, and she caught herself against the wall with one hand, and the sound she made was very small. Massimo turned. His hand came up, not to stop her, not grabbing, just a flat palm in the space between them. "Wait." She pressed herself back against the wall. He watched her face for 1 second to confirm she had it, and then he turned forward again. They moved toward the sound. The corridor opened into what had been the courthouse's main hall, a 2-story space with wooden gallery rails above and a central floor where benches had once been arranged in deliberate rows. The benches were stacked against the walls now, irregular shapes in the darkness. In the center of the space, illuminated by 2 portable work lights that cast sharp shadows upward in the way that made everything look more extreme than it was, Devon Brooks sat in a wooden chair with his wrists zip-tied to its arms. He was not visibly hurt. He was frightened. It was in every part of him, his shoulders, his jaw, the specific stillness of someone who has decided that movement might make things worse. He was talking because talking was something to do, something that confirmed he was still present in the situation rather than simply subject to it. Standing in front of Devon was Gregory Hawthorne. Gregory was not what the ballroom implied. In the ballroom, via association and reputation, he had been a force, a name attached to consequences, a shape in the story that occupied more space than any physical description could account for. In person, under portable work lights in an abandoned courthouse, he was a 67-year-old man in a suit that had been expensive 12 hours ago and was now creased at the elbows and dark at the collar from a night that had not gone the way he'd planned. He was heavy-set and gray, and he held himself with the particular rigidity of a man who has spent decades being given room and is now in a space where the room is contracting. He was holding a phone. He was looking at the phone when Massimo stepped out of the corridor into the hall. Gregory looked up. The 2 men looked at each other across the courthouse floor with the specific quality of people who have known of each other for a very long time and are meeting in a context neither of them chose. "I wondered how long," Gregory said. "The drive isn't negotiable," Massimo said. Gregory's jaw moved. He had known this already. She could see from his face that he had known it before Massimo arrived, had probably known it before he told his men to pick up Devon, had understood at some structural level that the move was bad, even as he made it, because sometimes people in losing positions make bad moves, not because they believe the moves will work, but because moving is better than stillness, because the alternative to doing the wrong thing is admitting there is nothing left to do. Then we have a problem, Gregory said. You have a problem, Massimo said. The records are with federal contacts. They've been transmitted. Retrieving the physical drive changes nothing at this point. Your window closed approximately 90 minutes ago. Gregory looked at him. Then why are you here? He said. And this was the moment, the specific, irretrievable moment that Zarya felt changed the room's molecular structure. When Gregory Hawthorne looked past Massimo and found her standing in the corridor entrance. His face did something that she had not expected and could not have prepared for. He smiled. It was not the smile of a man who was glad to see her. It was the smile of a man who has just rearranged his remaining pieces on the board and found, unexpectedly, that the configuration is more useful than he'd thought. Ms. Brooks, B.C. Brooks, Gregory said. I had a feeling Vanessa's little performance might bring you into this more directly than I originally intended. I want you to understand something. He looked at Devin, then back at her. The drive is gone. I accept that. The records are transmitted. I accept that too. But there are other records. Records that don't concern me. Records concerning people in that ballroom tonight who have their own reasons for wanting this evening to stay contained. People who, if I make certain calls, will ensure that whatever comes out of this investigation is considerably more complicated for everyone involved, including a hotel events manager who was present for every transaction I ran through that venue for the past 3 years. Zarya went still. You signed off on those booking logs, Gregory said. Your name is on 6 of them. Requisition approvals, catering invoices, storage area authorizations. You didn't know what they were for. I understand that. I'm not suggesting you did, but prosecutors don't always have the luxury of understanding nuance. And I have a very good legal team. The room processed this in silence. Devin looked at his sister with the expression of someone who is trying to determine whether the situation is as bad as it sounds, and whose face, when he finds the answer, confirms that it is. Zarya looked at Gregory Hawthorne and understood, fully and without the filtering effect of shock, what was being offered and what was being threatened, and the particular cruelty of it was not that it was a lie. It wasn't entirely a lie. She had signed those logs. She had signed them in good faith and without knowledge, but the signatures existed, and Gregory knew exactly what a signature looked like when it was stripped of its context and put in front of the right audience. She was still the easiest person in the room to blame, even now, even here. 3 choices, Gregory said. 1, you walk away. The drive stays buried, and this evening becomes a complicated misunderstanding for everyone. 2, you press forward, and I bury you in paperwork and legal procedure for the next 4 to 6 years while my team quietly discredits everything your name touches. Or 3, he looked at Massimo. You do what Massimo does, and this whole thing becomes something much louder and much uglier than either of us wants. The courthouse was very quiet. Devin's breathing was audible from where Zarya stood. She looked at her brother. She looked at Gregory. She looked at the 2 work lights throwing their hard, upward shadows across the old gallery rails and the stacked benches and the face of a man who had built everything he owned on the assumption that the right people would always, in the end, choose self-preservation over... She finished his sentence for him, not out loud. In the specific private language of someone who has spent 30 years watching the world arrange itself around the comfort of people like Gregory Hawthorne, she finished it completely, heard every word of it, understood its architecture and its weight and the particular confidence with which it was constructed. The confidence of a man who has offered this exact choice before and watched people make the sensible selection every single time. She looked at Gregory Hawthorne and she felt something leave her. Not break, not collapse. Something more deliberate than that. The specific release of a weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing it was weight. The careful self-minimization, the professional composure, the practiced art of taking up exactly the right amount of space and never 1 inch more. 8 years of it. 8 years of signing logs and managing events and training younger staff who would be promoted past her and absorbing every insult that came wrapped in the language of professionalism, and she had carried all of it with a patience that she had told herself was dignity. Gregory was still smiling. She said, Cut him loose. Gregory blinked. The smile didn't disappear. It reconfigured, became something less certain, the expression of a man who expected a different opening move. Ms. Brooks. Cut my brother loose, she said. Right now. And then we're going to talk about your three choices. I don't think you fully understand the position, your chum. I understand it completely, she said. I've been in some version of this position my entire career. A room full of people who've already decided the outcome. And me standing there with the truth and nowhere to put it. She took 2 steps forward into the light. The difference is that this time the truth has already left the building. You said it yourself. The records are transmitted. The drive is gone. So your legal threat, my name on those logs, that only works if the investigation is contained. If it's quiet. If nobody looks too hard. Gregory said nothing. But you just told a room full of witnesses, including Massimo De Luca, that you intend to use those logs as leverage against me. That's not a legal strategy. That's evidence of consciousness of guilt. And if I'm in a federal proceeding for the next 4 to 6 years, so are you, and your legal team spends that time explaining why you kidnapped a 22-year-old to silence his sister, which is a sentence that sounds exactly as bad in a courtroom as it does right now. The work lights buzzed. The courthouse held its cold. Devin was looking at his sister with an expression she hadn't seen on his face since he was about 9 years old, the specific expression of someone discovering that a person they already loved was more than they knew. Gregory's smile was gone. What replaced it was the face underneath the face, older, tireder, the face of a man who had been running a very complicated machine for a very long time and could feel, for the first time in perhaps years, the machine beginning to come apart in his hands. His jaw set. His eyes moved to Massimo, then back to Zarya, making the calculation she could see him making, looking for the piece she had missed, the leverage point she hadn't accounted for. He found it. Or he thought he did. Your mother, Gregory said. The word hit the room like a physical object. Zarya went very still. Patricia Brooks, Gregory said. He was watching her face with the focused attention of a man reading small print. Flatbush. She works at the Meridian Care Center, has for 11 years, licensed nursing facility. A facility whose operating license comes up for renewal every 3 years and whose last inspection flagged several minor compliance issues that were resolved quietly through the appropriate channels. He paused. Those channels have names. I know most of them. Devin's chair scraped the floor as his body reacted before his mind could stop it. Hey! Sit down, Gregory said, without looking at him, and the authority in his voice was so practiced and so automatic that Devin actually stopped moving, and then was visibly furious at himself for having stopped. Zarya had not moved. She was breathing in a way that required management, through her nose, measured, even, because the alternative was something she could not afford in this room. Her mother had worked at the Meridian Care Center for 11 years. She had built her professional life there the same way Zarya had built hers at the hotel. Carefully, quietly, with the specific pride of someone who knows the work is good even when the work goes unnoticed. The idea of Gregory Hawthorne's hands reaching into that, the bureaucratic, untraceable, absolutely deniable reach of a man with money and connections and nothing left to lose, she breathed. Now, Gregory said, and his voice had recovered some of its earlier quality, the quality of a man resettling into familiar ground. Let me ask you again, what's it going to be? Massimo spoke. He said, It's going to be this. He took his phone from his jacket pocket and turned the screen toward the room. What was on the screen was a live feed. The image was slightly compressed, the frame rate slightly low, the way footage looks when it's streaming from a device that's doing its best and not quite achieving it. But the image was clear enough. It was the grand ballroom of the Astoria Crown Hotel. And on the ballroom's main presentation screen, the screen normally used for charity slideshows and donor recognition and the projected logos of grateful foundations, footage was playing. The footage showed Vanessa Hawthorne at the display table, her hand on the necklace, the clasp giving, her face in the first 2 seconds, all of it. That started 4 minutes ago, Massimo said. The hotel's main screen and a simultaneous stream to accounts with combined reach of approximately 6 million. By the time we leave this building, it will have been picked up by at least 3 news aggregators and 2 networks that have been monitoring our situation since I made a call at 11:43. Gregory stared at the screen. The financial records are not just with federal contacts, Massimo continued. Copies were transmitted to 2 investigative journalists, one of whom has been working your development company's shell account structure for 14 months and was waiting for exactly this kind of documentation. The other is the financial correspondent for a publication that your lawyers have sued 3 times in the past 6 years, which means they will print this with a particular enthusiasm that I think we can all appreciate. Gregory's face was doing something complicated. Your legal threat against Ms. Brooks, Massimo said, has been recorded on 3 separate devices since you made it, and that recording will be in the hands of a federal prosecutor by 6 o'clock this morning. Your threat against Patricia Brooks was made in front of witnesses including myself, my associate, Devin Brooks, and whatever surveillance this building has that your people didn't think to check because you assumed a closed courthouse meant no coverage. He clicked the phone off and put it back in his pocket. There's a ceiling light fixture in the southeast corner of this room, Massimo said, that has a city-installed environmental monitor with a secondary visual function that was added during the 2021 courthouse security upgrade and was never removed when the building closed, because the city doesn't always update its own asset lists efficiently. My people found it 40 minutes ago. Everything in this room since we entered has been recorded and is streaming to a secure server. The silence that followed was total. Gregory Hawthorne stood in the center of an abandoned courthouse in the middle of the night and looked at the space where his options had been and found it empty. His associate, the man who had been standing near the corridor entrance since they arrived, whom Zarya had noticed and filed and not addressed, made a sound and reached into his jacket. Massimo's unnamed associate was faster, and the geometry of what happened next was very simple and resolved in about 2 seconds. And when it resolved, Gregory's man was against the wall with his arm at an angle that nature had not intended, and his jacket no longer contained what he had been reaching for. He made a sound. Devin made a sound. Zarya crossed the floor to Devin in 8 steps, found the zip ties at his wrists, thick ones, the kind with no give, and looked around for something sharp. Massimo was already there, a folding knife open in his right hand, and he cut the first tie without looking at her and the second one in a single motion, and Devin pulled his hands to his chest and pressed them together the way people do when circulation has been cut for long enough that the return of feeling is its own small shock. "You okay?" Zarya said. "Yeah." His voice was thinner than usual. Yeah. She gripped the back of his neck with one hand and put her forehead against his for exactly 1 second. He closed his eyes. She felt him exhale. Then she stood up and turned back to Gregory Hawthorne. Gregory had not moved. He was looking at the space in the middle of the room with the expression of a man who has just watched the last door close. His phone was in his hand, but he hadn't raised it. Whatever call he might have made, he was doing the arithmetic on whether it would arrive in time, and the arithmetic was not resolving in his favor. "My daughter," he said. His voice had changed. Not soft. Gregory Hawthorne's voice, she suspected, had not been soft in 20 years, but stripped. Stripped of the performance of authority, which left something that was less impressive and more human, and in a strange way more unsettling, because it was harder to oppose than the performance had been. "Vanessa didn't know the full scope," he said. "She knew I needed a distraction. She didn't know about the vault." "She knew about me," Zarya said. Gregory looked at her. "She knew you needed someone," Zarya said. "She picked me. She planted the clasp and the stones in my bag, which means she was close enough to me during that evening to do it without being seen, which means she was watching me. She didn't have to know what the vault was for. She knew what I was for." A pause. "So don't stand here and tell me your daughter is a victim." Gregory absorbed this. "No," he said after a moment. "I don't suppose she is." Outside the courthouse, at a distance Zarya couldn't judge, there was sound. It arrived first as a vibration. Something felt through the floor before it was heard, and then as the specific, unmistakable accumulation of multiple vehicles moving with purpose in the same direction. Zaria had been in New York her entire life. She knew the frequency of the city at midnight, the ambient noise of it, and she knew that what she was hearing now was not ambient. Massimo heard it too. "That's federal," he said, to no one specifically. "How long?" his associate said from the wall. 2 minutes. Maybe 3. Gregory heard it. She watched it register on his face. Not fear, exactly, because Gregory Hawthorne had been through enough legal situations in his career that the arrival of federal vehicles did not produce in him the same animal response it might produce in others. What it produced was the specific, resigned quality of a man who understands that the arithmetic has completed and arrived at an answer he cannot challenge. He put his phone in his pocket. "I want my lawyers present before any—" "They'll be called," Massimo said, "and Vanessa will have the same opportunity." Gregory looked at the floor. He was 67 years old, and in the flat upward light of the work lamps he looked every year of it, and several additional ones that hadn't happened yet. He looked like a man who has spent decades believing that money was a kind of permanence, and has just discovered, in the specific and irreversible way that only direct experience teaches, that it is not. Devon was on his feet. He had pressed himself back against the bench stack nearest the wall, not from fear anymore, but from the instinct of someone who wants to be out of the center of a room where serious things are still in motion. He was watching Zaria with the alert, slightly overwhelmed attention of a younger sibling reassessing a person they believed they already knew. Zaria was not watching Gregory anymore. She was watching the southeast ceiling fixture, the environmental monitor that may or may not have been streaming for the past 40 minutes. She had no way to verify what Massimo had said about it, whether it was real, whether the footage existed, whether the stream had actually connected to anything. She was aware of this. She was also aware that Gregory had believed it completely, which meant either it was true or Massimo De Luca's reputation was sufficient to make a bluff function as truth, and she was not entirely sure which of those was more significant. She looked at Massimo. "Was it real?" she said quietly. He met her eyes. "The journalists are real," he said. "The federal contact is real. The ballroom stream was real. That's already out." "That's not what I asked." A beat. "The monitor was a reasonable inference," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "A reasonable inference," she repeated. "The 2021 courthouse security upgrade was real. The asset list discrepancy was real. Whether this specific building was included. You bluffed him." "I gave him a framework," Massimo said, "in which the worst possible interpretation was the most rational one." She looked at the ceiling fixture. Then she looked back at him and said, "That's the same thing." "Yes," he said. "It is." The sound outside was louder now. Specific. Vehicles stopping, doors, the radio frequency of organized movement. Massimo's associate had moved Gregory's man from the wall to the floor and zip-tied his wrists with the same type of restraint that had held Devon, which struck Zaria as the kind of detail that said something about how thoroughly Massimo's people prepared for evenings like this. Devon had straightened up. He was 22 and his wrists hurt, and he had spent 2 hours zip-tied to a chair in an abandoned courthouse, and he was scared in the residual way of someone whose fear has peaked and begun to ebb, leaving behind a shaky, overstimulated alertness. He looked at Zaria and said, "Are we okay?" She looked at her brother. She looked at Gregory Hawthorne standing motionless in the center of the old courthouse floor. She looked at the ballroom footage she could still picture playing on a screen in a hotel she had worked in for 3 years, footage of Vanessa Hawthorne's hands on a necklace that had never belonged to either of them. She said, "We're going to be." It was not a lie, but it was not the whole truth either, and they both knew it, and Devon nodded anyway because he was 22 and his sister had come into an abandoned building in the middle of the night to find him, and sometimes that is enough truth to stand on while you wait for the rest of it to arrive. The door came open. Not the side door they had entered through. The main entrance, the wide, double-doored entrance at the front of the building that had once admitted lawyers and witnesses, and the occasional defendant, now admitting 6 federal agents in tactical gear who moved through the space with the specific efficiency of people who have cleared rooms before and find the choreography routine. They were followed by 2 men in plain clothes with credentials already in hand, and behind them, slightly back, A woman in a gray jacket with close-cropped hair and the expression of someone who has been waiting for this particular file to close for a very long time. She looked at Massimo. "De Luca," she said. "Agent Torres," he said, "you want to tell me why the courthouse security monitor was going to a private server?" A very brief pause. "I'd like to have my lawyers present for that conversation," Massimo said. Something moved across Torres's face that was in the neighborhood of amusement but was too tired to commit fully. She looked at Gregory Hawthorne. Gregory said nothing. She looked at Devin, at the marks on his wrists, at the zip tie still attached to the chair. She looked at Zarya. She took in the blazer that had once been pressed and perfect, and was now creased at the elbows and dark at one cuff, from where Zarya had braced herself against the courthouse wall. And she took in Zarya's face, which had been through 8 hours of things that left marks that a professional could read. "Are you injured?" Torres asked her. "No," Zarya said. "We're going to need a full statement." "I know." "Tonight." "I know." Torres looked at her for one more second, the specific look of a federal agent assessing whether a witness is holding themselves together or merely appearing to, and then turned to her team and began issuing instructions in a clipped, organized shorthand that reduced everything in the room to procedure. Gregory was taken into custody without theatrics. He did not protest. He did not make statements. He asked for his lawyers in a voice that had returned to something like its public register. Controlled, measured, the voice of a man who understood that the next several years of his life would be managed primarily by that voice and the people who spoke on his behalf. He walked out of the old courthouse between two agents with the specific dignity of someone who has decided that the only thing left to protect is how they leave. Zarya watched him go. She had expected in some part of herself to feel something more dramatic when it happened. The definitive closing of a door, the clean, cinematic satisfaction of a wrong being answered. What she felt instead was complicated and layered and somewhat exhausted, the feeling of someone who has been in a sprint long enough that stopping is its own physical experience. Devin put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she straightened. "Mom needs to know you're okay," she said. "Already texted her," Devin said, "when the agents came in and I found my phone in that guy's jacket." She looked at him. "What?" he said. "I know how to lift a phone back. I'm 22, not 12. She almost laughed. The sound that came out was adjacent to a laugh. Rough and compressed and shorter than a laugh, but real. Massimo was across the room, speaking quietly with Torres, whose expression during the conversation cycled between professional neutrality and the slightly pained quality of someone getting information they would have preferred to receive in a different form. His associate had been separated from the group by 2 other agents and was conducting his own quiet conversation near the gallery rail. The man who had been zip-tied to the floor was being processed with the methodical patience of federal procedure. Zarya watched Massimo's profile. She had spent the last several hours adjacent to a man whose motivations she had not been given time to fully examine, in circumstances that had not been conducive to examination, and she was aware that at some point, not tonight, tonight had enough, she would need to understand what had actually happened, what his presence at the gala had meant, and what the specific investment he had made in this evening was going to cost or require or become. But she also knew what she had seen in the ballroom, in the hotel corridor, in the car, in this room. She had seen a man who watched things carefully before he moved. She had seen someone who noticed the things people tried not to show, and she had seen him look at Gregory Hawthorne with the flat, patient expression of someone who had already decided, before he crossed the courthouse floor, before he produced the phone, before any of the pieces were in place, what the outcome of this room was going to be. She had done the same thing on the marble floor of the ballroom. She had decided, before her knees touched the ground, that they were not getting the confession. There was a version of that quality she recognized. She didn't fully trust the recognition yet, but it was there. Torres turned from Massimo and looked at Zarya across the old courthouse floor. "Ms. Brooks," she said, "we're going to need those statements now. We have a vehicle outside." Zarya looked at Devin. He nodded. He was fine. He was already fine. He was 22 and he would be fine. She looked at the room one more time. The stacked benches, the gallery rails, the cold stone of a building that had been designed to deliver justice and had, in its abandonment, managed it one final time. Then she walked toward the door. Massimo, from across the room, said her name. She stopped. She didn't turn immediately. She took one breath, the breath of someone who is deciding how to receive whatever comes next, and then she turned. He was looking at her with the expression he'd had since the ballroom, the one that gave nothing away. But there was something different in it now, something she couldn't fully name. The specific quality of a look from someone who has watched a person discover the full extent of what they are capable of and is deciding whether to say so. He said, "You didn't need me in there." She held his gaze. "No," she said, "but you were there anyway." She held it one more second. Then she walked out of the courthouse and into the cold air of the street, where the federal vehicles were parked at angles that caught the streetlight, and somewhere behind her the city was still running at its midnight frequency, and the ballroom footage was already spreading across every screen that mattered, and Gregory Hawthorne was in the back of a federal vehicle, and her mother's phone had 3 unread messages from Devin saying he was okay, and the night was not over, but the worst of it was. And Zaria Brooks walked into the cold with her shoulders straight and her blazer ruined and her spine didn't bend. The federal field office on Varick Street was the kind of building that processed human catastrophe with the same institutional indifference it processed paperwork. Fluorescent lighting, linoleum floors worn to a shine in the traffic patterns, chairs bolted to the wall in rows that discouraged comfort. Zaria sat in one of those chairs at 2:17 in the morning with a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for cooling on the table beside her, and she gave her statement to a junior agent named Ortiz, who typed everything she said with the careful, neutral attention of someone who had heard worse and was not going to let her know it. She told him everything. She told him about the necklace and the display table and the broken clasp. She told him about Charles Remington's face when she asked to see the footage. She told him about her knees on the marble and the sound of the laughter and the specific quality of 300 people deciding in real time that she was what they needed her to be. She told him about the booking logs she had signed over 3 years, the specific ones, the dates she could remember, and the ones she had to approximate. She told him about Gregory Hawthorne's face in the courthouse when he'd said her mother's name, and she told him what Gregory had said, and she watched Ortiz type it without expression and noted, for her own reference, that his typing speed increased slightly during that part of the account, which was the only indication he gave that he found it more significant than the rest. She did not cry during the statement. She had thought she might. There had been several moments during the evening where the thing in her chest had pressed very close to the surface. But what happened instead was that the act of narrating it, of placing one fact after another in sequential order, produced a specific kind of distance from the events that she recognized as what happened when you stopped experiencing something and started processing it. It was not a comfortable distance, but it was functional. Devin gave his statement in the next room. She knew this because she could hear his voice through the partition wall at intervals, not the words but the rhythm of it. Young and still slightly unsteady, the voice of someone working through something while being asked to work through something. He would be okay. She had decided this, and it was not wishful thinking. It was an assessment based on who Devin was, and who Devin was had not been altered by what happened to him tonight. That was not a given. She was aware of that. She was grateful for it in a way that didn't have language yet. At 3:45, Torres came in and sat across the table from her. Torres was 44, Zaria estimated. She carried herself with the particular economy of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that the work was endless and the hours were unreasonable and the outcomes were frequently unsatisfying and had decided to do it anyway. She had the file in front of her, but she didn't open it. The footage from the ballroom stream has been viewed approximately 400,000 times in the last 3 hours, Torres said. It's been picked up by 6 networks. The 2 journalists DeLuca contacted have both published preliminary pieces. One online within the hour, one with a longer piece going to print tomorrow morning. Zaria absorbed this. The logs you signed, Torres continued, we've been through the booking records. What you signed off on were standard event requisitions, catering, storage access, vendor coordination. The shell account transactions ran through a separate financial layer you wouldn't have had visibility into. You're not a target of this investigation. I want to be clear about that. I know, Zarya said. Torres looked at her. You knew before I said it? Gregory told me what he thought the exposure was. I had time in the car to think through whether it was real. She picked up the coffee, found it fully cold, set it back down. If my signatures were genuinely problematic, he would have used them 2 years ago when the federal review started, not tonight. He saved them for leverage, which means they were only useful as a threat. Real exposure doesn't wait. Torres was quiet for a moment. That's a sophisticated read for 2 in the morning after the night you've had. I've been working in rooms full of people who don't think I'm paying attention my entire career, Zarya said. You learn to pay attention. Torres nodded once. It was the nod of someone who has received information they already suspected and is confirming it rather than discovering it. Gregory Hawthorne will be arraigned this morning, Torres said. The charges include conspiracy, kidnapping, evidence tampering, obstruction, and about 7 additional items that his lawyers are going to spend the next year trying to unpeel. The financial records are extensive. Our team has been building towards something in his development accounts for over a year. Tonight gave us the documentation we needed. The vault. Yes. He built the whole evening around getting into it. The documents in that vault could have derailed a federal investigation into 3 other parties, one of whom has been cooperating with us since last spring. Gregory knew this. He also knew the investigation was getting close. He had a specific window. And Vanessa gave him the window. Torres paused. The pause was brief, but Zarya caught it. Vanessa Hawthorne has retained counsel, Torres said. She'll be charged with fabricating evidence, filing a false police report, and conspiracy to obstruct. The evidence against her from the external footage is substantial. She didn't know about the vault, Zarya said. No. But she knew someone was going to be hurt tonight. She just made sure it was a specific person. Yes, Torres said simply. The fluorescent light above them hummed at a frequency that suggested the ballast was aging. Somewhere down the corridor, a phone rang twice and stopped. What happens to Charles Remington? Zarya said. Conspiracy, obstruction, evidence destruction. He deleted the hotel footage himself. His fingerprints are on the system log. Zarya thought about Charles at 23 years into his career, building the most important professional relationship of his life, on the assumption that the Hawthorne family's patronage was a form of permanence. She thought about the calculation he had made over and over for years. Small compromise after small compromise, each one too incremental to seem like a moral event, until the accumulation became Gregory Hawthorne calling in a favor that required erasing footage of a woman being falsely accused. She did not feel sympathy for Charles Remington, but she understood the architecture of how someone became Charles Remington, and the understanding sat in her chest without resolution, the way true things sometimes do. We're going to need you available over the coming weeks, Torres said. There will be additional interviews, possibly grand jury testimony. I'll be available. You should also be prepared for significant media attention. The footage is already... I know, Zarya said. Torres looked at her across the table. A long, even look that was professional and also something slightly beyond professional. The specific look of one woman to another in a room where both of them have spent years being the person who pays attention in spaces designed for other people. You did well tonight, Torres said. Zarya looked at her. I was on my knees on a marble floor for 20 minutes while 300 people filmed me, she said. Yes, Torres said. And then you weren't. She got home at 5:10 in the morning. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in Morningside Heights that had good bones and unreliable heat and a landlord who responded to maintenance requests in geologic time. She had lived there for 6 years. She knew every sound the building made, the specific creak of the 3rd stair, the way the radiator expressed its opinions about temperature at irregular intervals, the particular quality of silence on her floor at 5 in the morning when the city was in the specific suspended state between night shift and morning commute. She unlocked her door and went in and stood in her kitchen for a moment without turning on the light. Her blazer went over the back of the chair, her shoes went by the door. She ran water in the sink and put her hands in it and stood there with the cold water running over her wrists until the sensation resolved from something she needed into something she was simply experiencing. Then she turned off the water and leaned her hands on the edge of the sink and looked at the kitchen wall and let herself, for the first time since 9:17 the previous evening, be without composure in a room where no one could see it. It lasted about 4 minutes. She was not a person who held it together beautifully and then released it gracefully. She held it together and then it came apart in the specific, ungraceful way of something that has been maintained under significant pressure. Quickly, and with a sound she was glad her neighbors couldn't hear, and with the specific physical aftermath of having held too many things for too long, which left her standing in her kitchen with her eyes burning and her legs unreliable and a precise understanding of exactly how tired she was. She let it happen. Then she washed her face, changed her clothes, made coffee that she actually drank this time, standing at the window with the pre-dawn city below her, watching the light at the corner change its colors for an audience of 0. She did not sleep. The weeks that followed were not, in any version, clean. The media attention Torres had predicted arrived with the specific force of a story that carried everything the news cycle required: money, race, beauty, crime, and footage clear enough that no one could argue about what they were seeing. The clip of Vanessa at the display table, the clasp breaking, the 2-second flash of guilt on her face. It played in a loop on channels Zaria did not watch, and was discussed at length she did not track, and the opinion surrounding it was overwhelming in her favor in a way that should have been satisfying and was instead frequently exhausting, because the same culture that was now loudly horrified on her behalf had for 8 years been the culture she had navigated quietly and without a platform. She said this once, in an interview she agreed to reluctantly with a journalist whose work she respected, and the sentence was pulled and amplified and generated its own secondary conversation, and she watched the conversation and felt the specific alienation of a person who has become a symbol for an argument larger than themselves and cannot fully locate themselves within it. Devin called her 3 times a week, more than he had before. He didn't always have things to say. Sometimes he just called to be on the phone to confirm that she was there and he was there, and the specific geometry of the family was intact. She understood. She did the same thing with her mother, stopping at the Meridian Care Center on her lunch breaks to sit in the break room and drink bad coffee and watch Patricia Brooks move through her shift with the precise, quiet efficiency of someone who has built a professional life on genuine care and does not require acknowledgement to continue it. Gregory's arraignment was covered by every major outlet. He entered a not guilty plea with the practiced calm of a man whose legal strategy had already pivoted to the work of reducing, minimizing, and prolonging. His lawyers were expensive and capable, and began immediately the slow technical work of complicating a case that was, at its core, not complicated. Zaria had been warned about this. She understood that the legal process operated in a different time signature than the moral one, and that the gap between those two signatures was where people like Gregory spent the years between exposure and consequence. She prepared herself for that gap. Vanessa's process moved faster, partly because the evidence against her was visual and irrefutable, and partly because her father's legal team had its hands full and could not prioritize her defense at the level she had perhaps expected. 3 months after the gala, in a proceeding that received considerably less media coverage than Zaria thought it deserved, Vanessa Hawthorne stood before a judge and entered a guilty plea to fabricating evidence and conspiracy. Her sentencing included community service, a suspended sentence contingent on additional conditions, and a restitution payment that was substantial in absolute terms and meaningless in the context of the Hawthorne fortune, or what remained of it. Zaria was in the courtroom. She sat in the 3rd row and watched Vanessa at the defense table, smaller somehow than she had been in the ballroom, or perhaps just more accurately sized, the ballroom having inflated everyone in it to their worst dimensions. Vanessa looked at the judge and not at the gallery, which was her right and probably her lawyer's instruction, and she spoke when spoken to in a voice that had none of its gala night performance and was instead flat and careful and unrevealing. The judge asked if she had anything to say. Vanessa said, "I understand what I did was wrong." It was the sentence her lawyers had workshopped. Zaria could hear the workshopping in it, the passive construction, the vagueness, the careful distance between the speaker and the action. She did not stand up and object. She did not demand more. She had wanted more, had spent weeks imagining a version of this moment in which Vanessa said something true and specific and costly, and she had eventually understood that what she was imagining was a different person than Vanessa was, making a choice that Vanessa had not yet developed the capacity to make, and waiting for it was waiting for something that didn't exist. She let it be what it was. She left the courthouse and stood on the steps in March cold and called her mother and said the proceeding was done, and Patricia said good, and neither of them said anything else about it because there wasn't anything else that needed to be said between them. Charles Remington pled guilty 2 weeks later. 17 years of professional reputation gone in a document with his signature at the bottom. His sentencing included a fine, probation, and a permanent bar from working in licensed hospitality management. Zarya heard this and thought about the careful, watchful man who had looked from Vanessa to her in the ballroom and made his calculation, and she thought about all the smaller calculations that had preceded it, and she thought that the smallest ones were the ones that mattered most. The first small yes, the first small look away, the first small erasure of someone else's discomfort in exchange for the preservation of your own position. She thought about this not to understand Charles, but to understand herself, and what she had or hadn't bent in similar moments over 8 years of her own career. The hotel's board reached out in the 4th week after the gala. The communication came through a law firm and was worded with the specific oiled language of institutional liability management. Expressions of regret, acknowledgments of failures in internal protocol, references to reviewing equity in compensation structures and advancement opportunities. At the end of the letter, buffered by several paragraphs of legal padding, was an offer, a settlement figure and an executive position, Director of Guest Experience and Operations, which was the position that had been given 3 years ago to a man named Philip, who had less experience and whom she had trained. She read the letter twice. She thought about Philip, who was not malicious and had probably not known what he was walking into when they gave it to him. She thought about the marble floor. She thought about what the position would mean, what it would cost her daily, to walk into that lobby, to manage events in that ballroom, to look at the display case in the East Corridor where the Meridian necklace had been the night her world pivoted. She declined. She did it in a letter of her own, which she drafted and redrafted 4 times over 2 days until it said exactly what she meant and nothing more. She was polite. She was precise. She said that she was grateful for the offer and that she did not accept it, and she said she wished the hotel well in its efforts toward the structural changes they had described, and she meant both of those things, and she signed it and sent it and felt, when it was gone, the specific release of a decision made without apology. The settlement she accepted. She had worked there for 8 years, and the settlement reflected, at minimum, what she was owed for 8 years of being underpaid and overlooked, and treated as movable furniture. She took the money without guilt and without gratitude, because guilt and gratitude both implied the transaction was a favor rather than an accounting. And it was an accounting. She had plans for it. The Calumet Hotel was a building that had been several things before it stopped being used. A luxury property in the 1930s, then a residential hotel in the 50s and 60s, then something harder to categorize in the years that followed, and then nothing or nearly nothing, a Harlem address with architectural bones that serious people occasionally photographed, and nothing else. It had been on the city's historical preservation watch list for 11 years. It had changed ownership twice in that time, without changing condition. The current owner was a small development trust that had run out of plans and was looking for someone with a different kind of idea. Zarya made an offer in April. It was lower than she could have offered because what she had was not enough to transform a building on her own, and she knew that going in. The financial structure she had drafted with a business attorney she trusted involved 3 other investors, a small business loan, and a historic preservation grant she had applied for through a program she had found by spending 3 consecutive Saturdays in the public library doing the kind of research that was boring and essential and that she had always been good at. The offer was accepted in May. She walked through the building on a Thursday afternoon with a structural engineer named Veronica, who pointed at walls and ceilings with the particular enthusiasm of a person who finds distress architectural, and spoke in a rapid, technical shorthand that Zarya wrote down in a notebook and looked up that evening and found mostly accurate. The building was in worse shape than the listing represented. It was also more beautiful than the photographs conveyed. The lobby ceiling was original plasterwork, intricate and partially intact, and the main staircase had a quality of proportion that modern building couldn't replicate. The specific grace of something built by people who believed the space they were making would outlast them and worked accordingly. She stood in the lobby for a long time after Veronica left. The afternoon light came through the tall front windows and landed on the dusty floor at angles that showed everything the room had been and could be. And she stood in it and felt the specific quality of a beginning that follows something difficult. Not clean, not simple, still carrying the weight of everything that preceded it, but oriented forward. She called Devin. "I need someone to help manage the renovation schedule," she said. "It's going to be chaos and the hours are unreasonable and it doesn't pay well right now." "I'm in," Devin said before she finished the sentence. I hadn't finished describing the job. "Doesn't matter. I'm in." She exhaled. "Okay," she said. Massimo De Luca came to the renovation site on a Wednesday in June. She knew he was coming. He had sent a message through a channel that was not a standard communication channel, and that she had found both elaborate and slightly amusing, which told her something about him and possibly something about herself. She had been expecting the contact and had not been able to fully determine what she felt about it, which was different from indifference and different from anticipation and sat somewhere between the two in a territory she hadn't mapped yet. He arrived without an entourage, which she appreciated. He was in a different suit from the gala, lighter, the color of charcoal at a distance, and he looked at the building's exterior with the expression of someone who appraises things accurately and has enough experience to do it without showing the work. She was on the front steps with a coffee and a set of floor plans she'd been arguing with since 7 that morning. "It's bigger than it looks in the listing," he said. "Everything is bigger than it looks in the listing," she said. "That's the first thing I've learned." He came up the steps and she led him into the lobby and watched him look at it. The ceiling, the staircase, the afternoon light doing its thing with the floor. He was quiet for long enough that she started to understand it was genuine, not performed. "What do you want it to be?" he said. She had answered this question for banks and grant committees and her own mother, and the answer was always shaped to some degree by the audience. She thought about what answer she was shaping now, and then decided against shaping it. "A place where people who were told no get to find out what yes feels like," she said. "Staff, guests, everyone in the building, talent that got passed over because of how they look, or where they came from, or how much space they take up." She paused. "Good hotel, good food, real luxury, the kind that isn't about exclusion." He looked at the lobby ceiling. "The plasterwork needs significant restoration," he said. "I know." "That's expensive." "I know that too." "There's a firm in Brooklyn," he said, "that does historical restoration work. They're very good. I have a relationship with them." She looked at him. "I'm not asking for money," she said. It was not defensive. It was informational, the tone of someone who needs the other person to understand the terms before continuing. "I know," he said. "A referral isn't money." She looked at him a moment longer. "A referral would be useful," she said. He nodded once. They walked through the main floor together, and she showed him the structural engineer's notes, and he read them with the attention of someone who understands construction and asked 3 questions that demonstrated this, and she answered them. And it was a conversation between 2 people who had stood in a courthouse together at midnight and come out the other side of it and were now standing in a different building in the afternoon light doing the ordinary specific work of a next thing. At the back of the main floor near the old kitchen access, she stopped. "Torres told me the investigation produced enough to ensure Gregory doesn't negotiate out of the serious charges," she said. "Yes." "Your cooperation with her?" "Was in my interest," he said. "I know why it was in your interest," she said. "I'm asking what it cost you." He was quiet for a moment. 3 business relationships that had value," he said. 2 of which I chose to end anyway. 1 I didn't, and the part of your operation that Torres is now aware of." "She was aware of it before," he said. The evening clarified the terms of what she does and doesn't pursue. Zaria looked at him. "You're telling me you're in a negotiated position with a federal agent." "I'm telling you the world is more complicated than the stories told about it," he said, "and that I have spent 20 years operating inside that complication, and I am continuing to make decisions about where I want to operate." "The logistics company," she said. "The private security operation." Something shifted in his face, very slightly. The specific shift of someone who has been researched and is deciding what to do with that information. "You looked into me," he said. After the courthouse, she said. Yes. And I have questions I'm not going to ask tonight, she said. And things I've decided don't change what I think about what happened in that ballroom in that courthouse. And things that might matter later that I'm keeping on a shelf until I have more information. She looked at him steadily. I'm not naive about who you are. I'm also not performing sophistication about it. I don't know you well enough yet to know exactly what I think. He looked at her. Yet, he said. Yet, she confirmed. The afternoon light had shifted while they were talking, moved from the western windows to a lower angle that caught the plasterwork ceiling and showed its detail. The scrollwork around the central medallion, the dental molding at the cornice, the work of hands that had built something to last. Massimo looked up at it. It's a good building, he said. It's going to be, she said. The Calumet Hotel opened the following spring on a Friday evening in March, 9 months and 11 days after Zarya made the first offer, and approximately 14 months after a woman was forced to her knees on a marble floor in a different hotel while 300 people recorded it on their phones. The opening was not the kind of event the Astoria Crown hosted. There were no charity foundations, no collector's jewelry on display tables, no photographers from society publications working the room. There was a jazz quartet Zarya had found through a Harlem music program that placed working musicians in live venues. There was food from 3 local restaurants she had partnered with, small plates circulating through a lobby that now had its plasterwork fully restored and glowing warm under lighting she had spent a week getting right. There were guests from the neighborhood and guests from the industry and guests from the city's civic and cultural life, and there were 34 staff members who had been hired through a process that valued skill, experience, and character over appearance, age, and the particular social legibility that luxury hospitality had historically required. Marcus was there. He was the new events coordinator, a title that came with a salary that Zarya had benchmarked against industry standards and then exceeded by 12%, because she had decided that the industry standard was wrong and she was going to be a data point for something different. Devin was there, having spent 9 months learning the operational side of hotel management with the specific dedication of someone who has found the thing they're actually good at and is mildly annoyed it took them until 22 to find it. Patricia Brooks arrived at 7:30 in her good coat and stood in the lobby for a full minute before she said anything, looking at the ceiling, the staircase, the warm light, the people moving through the space with the ease of people in a place designed for their comfort. Your grandmother would have, she started. I know, Zarya said. Patricia put her hand on her daughter's face, both hands, briefly, the gesture of a mother who has been frightened for someone and is confirming with her hands what her eyes have already told her. Then she dropped them and straightened her coat. The flowers by the door are crooked, Patricia said. They're not crooked, Zarya said. The left one. Zarya looked. The left arrangement was marginally, not quite level. I'll fix it later, she said. Fix it now, Patricia said. First impressions. Zarya fixed the flowers. She was crossing back through the lobby when she saw Massimo in the doorway. He had come, as he had come to the gala, alone. He was looking at the room with the expression he had worn since the first night she saw him. The expression that contained no performance, that evaluated without advertising the evaluation. But it was softer tonight, or she could read it better now, one of the two. He was looking at the lobby the way a person looks at something that is exactly what it said it would be, which is rarer than it should be and always worth a moment of attention. Their eyes met across the room. The room was full. The quartet was playing something warm and unhurried. The people around them were talking and eating and moving through the space with the ease of people who feel they belong in it, which was the specific thing Zarya had been building toward since she stood in the empty lobby for the first time with afternoon light on the dusty floor. She had been on her knees in a room like this. Not this room. A different room, a different night, a different version of herself that she had not abandoned so much as metabolized, made into something that moved through her rather than something she carried. Massimo crossed the lobby. He stopped in front of her. He looked at the room for a moment and then at her. You did it, he said. We're not done, she said. The East Wing isn't finished, and the restaurant permit is still in processing, and the third floor HVAC gave me problems this week. that I'm going to be dealing with for the next month. I know, he said. You did it anyway. She looked at him. There were things between them that had not been named and were not going to be named tonight, in a room full of people, with a jazz quartet playing and her mother 7 feet away adjusting a flower arrangement that was now probably too adjusted. There were questions she still had and things she still didn't know, and a version of the future that she had not yet outlined because she had been too busy building a present to get ahead of herself. But she was standing, in her building, on a Friday in March, with the plasterwork restored and the light right, and 34 people who had been told no by various rooms working with intention and skill in the room she had made. Thank you, she said, for the courthouse, for the bluff you may or may not have run with the ceiling monitor, for the referral to the Brooklyn firm. She paused. For the ballroom. He held her gaze. The ballroom, he said. You watched, she said, before you did anything. You watched long enough to see what was actually happening. Most people didn't. She met his eyes. That mattered. The quartet moved into something slower. The room moved around them with its own warm momentum. Massimo said, You didn't need the watching to hold. No, she said, but it helped to know someone was doing it. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet, with weight and intention rather than absence. The East Wing, he said. The HVAC. What about it? The firm I mentioned knows a mechanical contractor. She almost smiled. Send me the contact, she said. Tomorrow, he said. Tonight, she said. And the room filled with the specific sound of people in a place that was built for them, and the light held warm over restored plasterwork that had waited 60 years for someone to decide it was worth the work. And Zaria Brooks stood in the center of it. Not at the edge, not in the margins, not in the careful, minimized posture of someone who had learned to take up exactly the right amount of space and never 1 inch more. She stood where she wanted to stand. And nobody in the room, not one person, thought that was anything other than exactly right.